Cranes, and I'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you very much. What we're talking about tonight are Florida Sandhill Cranes, mostly Florida Sandhill Cranes. And of the 15 species of cranes in the world, we have 2 of them in North America. In fact, 2 of them in the New World. There's no cranes in South America. So the 2 New World cranes are whooping cranes and sandhill cranes. And interestingly enough, they have recently decided that sandhill cranes, after being in the genus Gruis for 200 years or so, actually belong in the genus Antigone with white-naped cranes, Barolga cranes, and Saris cranes. And the puzzling thing about that is those 3 cranes are all Asian birds.
Oh,
and
they're not
even geographically close to North America. And so they're not, sandhill cranes are not in the same genus anymore with our other crane, the whooping crane. The reason we were able to study sandhill cranes for 25 years is because the Game and Fish Commission, or Fish and Wildlife Commission, was in a project to attempt to reestablish a non-migrating population of whooping cranes in North America. Historically, there were non-migrating whooping cranes in Louisiana and possibly Florida. We know there are some early records of whooping cranes in Florida, but there's no evidence of whether they migrated or not. So for 25 years, we studied sandhill cranes as surrogates for whooping cranes. And the question we wanted to know was, how would the ecology of a reestablished population of non-migrating whooping cranes compare with our population, the natural population of non-migrating Florida Sandhill Cranes? This is the crew that the actual final employees that worked on the project. And throughout the whole history of it, though, we had about 30 different people that worked on it from the beginning to the end. All cranes share certain characteristics in common. One of them is they're perennially monogamous. You'll hear them referred to as paired for life. That's not true. We'll talk about that a little bit. But they are perennially monogamous, which means they stay with the same mate for year after year after year. They are also long-lived, upwards of 30, 40 years. They have deferred sexual maturity. They have low annual fecundity and high parental investment in their offspring. Cranes also share a common characteristic in this, some kind of an adornment to the head or face. For us, the sandhill crane, it's this papillose red skin on the top of the head, which is actually under their control. They can make it bigger or smaller. They can expand that patch or make it smaller and engorge it with blood and make it redder. So you can look at a crane in a social setting and find out who the tough guy is. He's the guy with the biggest patch on his head and the reddest patch on his head. And if he's intimidating another crane and that crane is trying to be subordinate, he'll constrict the patch and it will be duller in color. Male and female cranes look exactly the same. You can't tell them apart by looking at them, but they do have a behavior that identifies sex. The male's slightly larger than the female. So if they're side by side, you can sometimes tell that. But when they do this call, the unison call, which they give together, the male's posture is like this, with his head held vertical, and they give a long, loud call. The female head is held at a 45-degree angle, and she gives a flipping her head and gives a tuck, tuck, tuck call. So when you see them doing this, you can right away tell which one's the male and which one's the female. They also give another call together, which is probably the most frequently heard call is the guard call, and they both give it together simultaneously. It's another duet, and the sounds are pretty much the same, except the male pitch is lower. So when you hear them doing that, if they're side by side, you can see by the pitch of the call which one is the male and which one's the female. Adult cranes give at least 20 different readily distinguishable calls, and the chicks give about 8 different calls. Most of the calls are either loud rattle calls, which is like the guard call and the unison call. They also have non-rattle calls, which are hisses. They will hiss when they're threatened. They give moans and they give honk calls, and they give trills and purrs. The common call of the chick is a high-pitched trill call, which they give until they're almost a year old. Florida has the largest population of non-migratory cranes. There are two other subspecies that also don't migrate: the Cuban sandhill crane and the Mississippi sandhill crane, both of which are endangered species. Our birds are not endangered, although they probably should be listed as threatened or certainly species of special concern. The range of the Florida sandhill crane is basically the peninsula of Florida, interior part of the peninsula, and there's a little bump in the population that extends up into Okefenokee Swamp in Georgia. The other crane we have is the eastern migratory population, the eastern greater sandhill crane. And they migrate here for the winter and stay until this time of year. They're headed back right now, back to the Great Lakes area. And because we have both a population of non-migratory and migratory cranes, Florida is probably the best place in the world to study the question of migration versus non-migration in cranes. This is the range of the eastern population of migratory greater sandhill cranes. They traditionally bred in Wisconsin, Michigan, little bit of Minnesota, and migrated through the Midwest, eastern Midwest, stopping at Jasper-Pulaski in Indiana, as that's our version of the Platte, if you will. They sometimes gang up there in several tens of thousands in migration, and then they overlap the Florida sandhill crane during the winter. This population has expanded a good bit in recent years, and now they're breeding in Ontario, Quebec, and even back into New England. So there's been a major expansion in that population. When we first started studying, they were probably maybe 3,000 or 4,000. Now the population is something like 60,000. Historically, most of the wintering graders did winter in Florida. Now they're wintering more of the birds are wintering outside of Florida, in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, Kentucky, and even some staying in Indiana. One of the questions that everybody wants to know is how you can tell the difference. Well, sometimes you can tell which ones are migratory and which ones are not migratory. One of the easiest ways early in the season, particularly, is when you approach a bunch of cranes and some of them walk away and some of them don't. The ones that don't walk away are our local birds. The ones that walk away or fly away are the migratory birds. But if you can see the colors of the stain on their feathers, you can sometimes distinguish a migratory from a non-migratory crane. The migratory birds, particularly those from the areas where they have lots of iron oxide in the soil, will stain their feathers with this iron oxide, and they become quite red and readily different than our birds. Our birds have a different soil type that they use, and it doesn't look anything like this. It's more of a we called it a clay color. It's much grayer and darker, hardly contrasts much with their regular feathers. And interestingly enough, early on, the lesser sandhill crane, the one that migrates through the central U.S., was described, it was called the little brown crane, and somebody found out that all this brown was really just stain, and it would come off readily when you put hydrochloric acid on them, and they turn back into a gray bird. So that's why they're not called little brown cranes anymore. This brown feathering that they get, the stain feathers, are distinct from the juvenile plumage, which has a brown quality to it, but it has this linear patch along the coverts, and it's really obvious that this is not a randomly stained bird. This is a more systematic bird, and they also have this on the back of their head, these brown feathers on the back of their head, which also distinguishes the chick. They'll sometimes hang on to these feathers until well into their beyond their first year and start of the second year. And so you can, if you get a good look at them, you can sometimes see some remnants of these brown tipped or buffy tipped primary wing coverts. These are the last juvenile feathers that they lose. So one of the questions was, why do they do this staining? And a lot of people thought it was cosmetic because they just didn't want to be dull gray. Some people thought it was cryptic, that they would use this to camouflage themselves during nesting season. And others thought it was maybe a maintenance behavior for feather maintenance. The one thing we do know, or we did find with our birds anyway, is that they will actually go and seek out a specific type of soil, like I said, clay, and they'll actually mine it, dig a hole and mine it, and they'll just literally stand in line to get access to this dirt, and then they'll pick up a lot of dirt, rub it on their feathers. They work it into the back feathers and particularly the wing feathers, and the only parts that they can't get to are the parts they can't reach with their bill. So my thinking was they really do this as a maintenance thing for feather maintenance, and it's also to get rid of feather lice. Feather lice can get really a heavy infestation of feather lice, and this clay soil with its fine grain may be a way to protect them from feather lice. So at a certain point, we had to find out what these birds were doing as individuals. You can only learn so much about them by looking at them as a group. So in order to find out their individual behaviors and individual preferences for each other, as it were, we had to capture some. So the method that we used mostly was a drug tranquilizer that we would apply to corn as a bait. They would be baited to a pre-baited site. And then the morning we wanted to capture them, we put out this drug-laced bait, and they would come in and feed on it, we hope, because if they didn't eat it all, we had to go pick it all up. And after about 30 minutes, they began to get sleepy, and we could literally sneak up behind them and put a net over them and take them back and weigh them, measure them, record characteristics about their health and plumage, that sort of thing. And then some of them got radio transmitters, but all of them got an individual color band combination. So we could recognize them as individuals once they've been released. And then they were taken back to the same area where we captured them and released. In all, we captured 310 Florida Sandhill Cranes, 550 Eastern Greater Sandhill Cranes, and about 560 recaptures. Some of these were the same individuals caught year after year after year, so we could look at them over a period of several years. And about 70% of the birds we released, or we caught and banded, were sighted within a month after release. We figured by a month after they were handled and captured, they had recovered and were behaving normally after that. So we didn't record any data until about a month after they were released. We use these marked individuals, both radioed and color banded, to determine the home range size for a Florida Sandhill Crane. And what we found out were the subadults, which are non-territorial, have an average home range of about 5,125 acres. Adults that stayed on their territory year round had an average home range size of 600 acres. And most of the adults were forced to leave their territory at certain times of the year, and they had an average home range size of 1,600 acres. We also used radio telemetry to locate nests of some of these birds, the ones we were most interested in. This is a typical sandhill crane nest. They build the nest in Florida. They build the nest in aquatic vegetation, particularly pickerelweed and newfar. And they build it out of the existing, whatever the local vegetation is. And when they're building the nest, the males will stand in the grass and the vegetation, pick up little bits of the vegetation and put it on top of the platform, and the female will stand on the platform, and she's arranging this stuff around the nest, and she actually builds the nest, and then they line it with grass stems. Typically, the nest is in open water, standing water, about 18 inches or 2 feet deep. They also nest on, when in deeper water, they'll nest on these floating mats of vegetation. And when they do that, they don't need to build a big nest, a big complicated nest. They just drag up a few little grass stems and build basically an egg cup. And because they're on this floating mat of vegetation that's well away from shore, they don't have to worry about predators. And so the reason they build this big nest structure in the water is for protection from predators. Interestingly enough, the Cuban sandhill crane, which evolved without predators, without mammalian predators, builds a nest exactly like our birds do when they nest on a floating mat of vegetation or on dry land. They just drag up a little bit of straw and grass stems and build an egg cup, and that's it. So it's mammalian predators that they're mostly protecting themselves from when they build a big, elaborate, high nest like that. The nest exchange occurs throughout the day. Males and females both incubate, and they share the incubation, and they exchange nest duties several times during the day. So if during nesting season in Florida, which is December to January to May and June, if you see a single bird out by himself, it's most likely a nesting adult bird that's off duty, and he's out feeding and getting ready to go back and take over the next bout of incubation. This is a typical incubation posture for sandhill crane. They have their head up, and they're always watching what's going on. And if they're disturbed or somebody gets too close to the nest, they'll drop their head like this to try to remain as inconspicuous as they can. They're very reluctant to leave the nest. You almost have to walk right up on them to get them to leave. They prefer to just sit tight and hope you'll walk away. The main cause of nest failure in Florida, as we found, was flooding. So even though they build this big elaborate platform, and it can rise and fall with the water levels, a lot of times we'll get a big heavy rain in nesting season, and the nest will be flooded. But for Florida cranes, interestingly enough, they're able to re-nest, and sometimes we've had them re-nest as many as 3 different times. So they can build 4 nests in a year before they run out of time. And the average interval between nests is only 19 days. Even sometimes after they've lost chicks, they will re-nest. Now, it's not quite so fast as 19 days, but certainly in the under 30 days, they'll be back on another nest. So because we have such an extended nesting period, they're able to get fertile again, find a new nesting spot, build a new nest, all this within 19 days. So this is one of the reasons that cranes are perennially monogamous, and they seem to stay in physiologic synchrony throughout the nesting season. The nest, like I said, the nest clutch size is like 2, and the eggs are laid 2 days apart, and incubation starts with the laying of the first egg, so the eggs hatch asynchronously. So the first egg will hatch, and 2 days later, the second egg will hatch. Even though they lay 2 eggs and hatch 2 eggs, typically only 1 chick survives. And what we found, or what has been found out, is that the main problem is there's sibling rivalry between the oldest chick will beat up on the youngest chick. And the factor that seems to mitigate this is availability of resources. If there's plenty of resources, there's a reduction in this sibling rivalry. So the more there is to eat, the less aggressive they are to each other. Average brood size in Florida is 1, and that's consistent with the whole population throughout the world. But sometimes they're able to raise 2 chicks, and they'll have twins. About 25% of the times for our birds, they have twins. Rarely will they have 3. And we only saw this once. So it's very, very uncommon. The thing that puzzled me initially was if they only raise 1 chick, why bother laying 2 eggs? Well, if you can raise 2 chicks 25% of the time, then it's to your advantage to have that extra egg, not only as a precautionary egg in case the first one either doesn't hatch or dies early, but also in a year with good resources, they can raise twins. So if you can do that often enough, it's really to your advantage to have that extra egg available for a good year. And you can tell if it's a good year by the proportion of the population that has twin chicks. Cranes are very precocious. They can move around and follow their parents within 24 hours of hatching. And within a week or so of hatching, this is a bird that's about a week old, they'll lose this egg tooth, which is that little white speck on the end of his bill. And that's what they use to break out of the shell. That is reabsorbed by the end of the first week. And if you see bird with an egg tooth, you know it's a recently hatched bird. This is one that's about 30 days old. They grow rather rapidly. This is one that's 45 days old. You'll often hear of cranes being referred to as colts. And I can understand why that would be, because at this stage, they're like a young horse. They're mostly legs and kind of gawky. But even though they're no longer in the genus Gruus, they're not a horse. By 75 days of age, they've reached their full adult height. They can fly and perfectly able to keep up with their parents, of course. But they don't reach their full adult mass until they're 270 days old. So they're still growing. Even though they can fly and feed on their own, they're still growing. It takes almost a full year for them to get to be a full-grown bird. Early on, the parents will feed them bill to bill. They'll pick up food and hand it to the chick. This goes on for about the first 2 weeks. Then after that, they will gradually encourage the bird to feed on its own by dropping the food in front of them and letting the chick pick it up itself. And ultimately, they will just lead the chick to where there's food and let him feed on his own. We wanted to know a lot about how these chicks behave, because like I said earlier, we're trying to compare this with the behavior of an introduced population, which, because they're raised in captivity, we have no idea how they would perform in the wild. So we wanted to know what regular Florida cranes would do, so we could compare that with a reintroduced population of non-migratory whooping cranes. So we put radio transmitters on these little chicks. These radios are glued to their back, and then the birds are released right back where we caught them. And we actually had an observer that sat off at a distance that was able to keep an eye on the place where we put these birds down, and certainly they kept an eye on the parents. The parents never go very far away. They're around fussing at us all the time. And our question was, how long does it take for the parents to come back and reclaim these chicks? And literally, it's just minutes. Almost as soon as we turn around and walk away, the parents are starting to come back, and well within 10 or 15 minutes, their family's back together again. In the older chicks, these radio bands, these glued-on bands ultimately fall off. So in the older chicks, we had to recapture them and put a different kind of transmitter on them, a leg band transmitter. And it's not as easy as one might think to catch a crane chick, even though will hide in the grass, and like this bird is doing right here, literally let you walk up and pick him up. And this is a fairly big bird. That's what their instinct tells them to do. And they're so good at it that if you don't know exactly where those birds are, when you go to catch one, you're just as likely to step on one as you are to see him and catch him. So what we found out was the best method for us was to have an observer that watched the family as we approached them to capture the chick. And what the family would do is the adults, the parents, would make a big fuss and run off in one direction, and the chick would drop his head, get really low in the grass, and run in the other direction. And you kind of only can guess where that chick was going to go. So we had somebody that would sit off at a distance, keep a scope on that chick, and watch where he went and hid in the grass, and then direct the capture team in to actually pick up the chick. And that turned out to be a fairly successful way of catching chicks. Because if you, like you say, if you try to do it on your own, you'll get so frustrated you can't find the chick. And if you do, like I said, you're just as likely to step on him as you are to catch him, because they will certainly hold tight like that. One of the other things we noticed, which was rather interesting, is after we've captured them and handled them, and then we turn them loose, they're sometimes so aggressively, they're trying to defend themselves. They will actually turn around and challenge us rather than run away. So they're kind of tough. The main cause of chick mortality we found was the small chicks, it's avian mortality. Older chicks, it's mammalian mortality. Even fledged chicks, the birds that can fly, will stay with their parents for almost a full year, 10 to 11 months of age, and maybe even older. It depends on what the nesting conditions are. If the water's not right for nesting, they'll stay with their parents for almost a full year or beyond their first year. One of the other things we wanted to know was the interactions of chicks with their parents. Like I said, because we're trying to compare this with an experimental population of non-migrating whooping cranes. So one of the things we were interested in was what was the natal dispersal like in crane chicks. We found that males, average distance they go from the natal dispersal is the distance that bird travels from the point of birth to the point of setting up its first territory to begin to reproduce. In males, they stay pretty close to home, and they go, range was a half a mile to 6 miles from their point of natality. Females are the ones that wander, and they go up to 30 miles away. So this is how the genes are spread throughout the population, and this is another method that will prevent them from breeding with their siblings, because the females go further away than their brothers do, and therefore they spread the genes more widely. We also wanted to know if there were different preferences in either parent. Were they as likely to go with one or the other, or does it matter? And does the proximity of the chicks to their parents change as they get older? And how does it change? So what we found was that in the first 6 months, the chicks stay much closer to the female, which makes sense because she does most of the feeding. The male does some feeding, but he also spends a lot of time guarding and watching what's going on. Also, during the first 8 months, the chicks usually stay within 15 feet of their nearest parent, and the distance increases quite dramatically after that. Separation of parents from their chicks occurs at 10 to 11 months of age. And when we looked at all the characteristics, all the factors we could think of to compare, the one that stood out the most as determining when the chick leaves its parents was when the parents are going to lay their next set of eggs. So if you're a successful crane parent, you're either building a nest, securing a territory, building a nest, laying eggs, incubating those eggs, raising those chicks, and then once those chicks leave, within 30 days, you're doing it again. So you're hardly have any time to do anything else but deal with your chicks. So it's a full-time job, literally. The typical day of a non-nesting crane is in the morning, they get up from the roost, wake up and fly off about between sunrise and 30 minutes after sunrise. They feed through the morning. By the middle of the day, middle of the morning, they go back to find some water, drink, loaf, and socialize. In the afternoon, they go back and do it again. They'll fly back out again and feed again in the afternoon. A lot of times, Florida cranes will walk rather than fly from roost. So they can, and sometimes it doesn't look like they fly at all during the day. They'll just walk to roost, walk from roost, go walk back to the water, and then walk back out and feed again. So they're not as prone to flying long distances as the migratory birds are. So in the evening, they return to roost again about 30 minutes before to 30 minutes after sunrise. So feeding, they feed a lot in the marshes. They feed in open grasslands. They feed in pastures. They'll feed in ag fields, they like corn stubble. They'll feed in peanut fields. They will also feed in the woody edges around these open areas. Sod fields, they'll use sod fields too. For the first 2 weeks after hatching, the families almost exclusively feed in the marsh near where the nesting is. But what we found out was that when you look at the year activity of a family of cranes, or any crane for that matter, wetlands and uplands are equally important. And in fact, in some cases, the uplands may be more of a factor in determining the quality of the territory or habitat than the wetlands. When I mentioned earlier that some adult pairs leave their nesting territory for part of the year, the reason they leave is the upland habitat is not enough to sustain them and the chick. So they'll go someplace with better upland quality to finish out the raising of the chick. And so uplands and wetlands make the difference. And most of the uplands that they prefer are low growth, low vegetation, less than 18 inches, because if it gets much higher than that, that's where the predators are. So as I said, mammalian predators are the biggest problem they have once the chicks are of any size at all. And they'll hide in the grass, and that's where they get ambushed. Roosting sites are typically in the water, of course, and the characteristics of a roost site are somewhat subtle. They like a roost site with a firm bottom. They don't want too much vegetation. They want to be able to get out of there if they have to in a hurry. And they will actually, if they find a spot that's really good, particularly in dry conditions, they will gang up in big numbers on a really good roosting site. That other picture there with all those cranes in it, that was a roost site that had at some point 85 Florida Sandhill cranes roosting together in that site. So one of the questions that has always puzzled people is, how do pair bonds form? You'll see references to pairs forming because of dancing or after dancing. I don't think that's true. Cranes will dance for any number of reasons. They dance when the weather changes. If you watch them when there's a thunderstorm coming and the cool breeze starts to go in the summertime, weather changes, they will start dancing. They'll dance if they see a predator. They will dance if one bird starts dancing, it becomes very contagious and the whole population will dance. Juvenile birds will dance. Even birds that aren't even a year old will dance. So I don't think pair formation is really based on dancing. Dancing may help to synchronize the pair bond, but I think the pair formation is a much more subtle process over an extended period of time. So we just don't know exactly what it takes to form a pair. This behavior here with these two birds confronting each other, that's not dancing. That's a very aggressive behavior. It's called kick rake. And it's one that can actually do some damage to a bird. They have a toe on one of their toes on each foot is kind of turned to the side, and they've got a sharp edge on it, and they can actually slash each other with that toe. So this is their most aggressive posture behavior, but it's not dancing. Other postures that they exhibit, these two upper slides are showing a pre-flight posture and a pre-cop posture, and they look a lot alike. In fact, they're pretty similar, but they each have a vocalization that goes with them. The pre-flight is a loud purr call, and they will point themselves in the direction they intend to fly, and it's basically alerting other birds that they're going to take off. The pre-cop posture, when we first saw these birds doing this, I had no idea what this was. And we called it sky watch because it looks like they're looking at the sky, but it's actually soliciting copulation. And actually the female does it most, but males can sometimes do it too. And it can serve as a, like I say, a pre-copulation behavior, or it can also serve as an intimidation behavior for other cranes. And they will sometimes give this as a way of a territorial posture that says, this is my territory and we're here. They don't usually do this except on their territory. So once they're exhibiting this posture, it's obvious that this is their territory. The other thing they do a lot is the directed walk threat, which is accompanied by a guard call. The aggressive bird will approach the bird he's trying to intimidate and lower his head and show that expanded red patch on the top of his head, and the other bird will usually submit and walk away. If he doesn't walk away, then they go to this other posture, which is called bill sparring, where they'll confront each other and try to get their heads above the other bird. And if no bird relents from that, then it goes to the kick rake. The other thing that you see sometimes is this bow threat, which is given by a bird, usually given after they fly towards another bird, and they'll land again. It's a territorial behavior. They'll fly to a bird that's invaded their territory and land and display this, drop the head, and again, showing the crown and intimidate the other bird. Another behavior you'll see a lot is this bill stab, and it does not have a vocalization. The bow threat has a low growl call. This one has a just nothing. They don't make any noise at all. They'll just sneak up on other pretend. They actually will pretend like they're feeding, sneak up on another bird, and then stab it and drive it away. So one of the demographic characteristics, some of the demographic characteristics that we found was the sex ratios are about 50-50. About a third of the population is breeding age adults. The rest are subadults and young of the year. And about 60% of the chicks that hatch survive to leave their parents. Like I said, average age is 327 days. Age of first breeding, males, they can actually make an effort to breed after their second year. In females, it's after their third year, but typically they don't successfully raise any chicks until they're 5 to 7 years of age. Average life expectancy of any bird that reaches an age to leave its parents is 7 years. The maximum age of a Florida Sandhill crane that any of the cranes we marked was 27.5 years. And that bird is still alive. So every year we get another tick up in how old they are. We got several birds that we marked and watched exceeded 20 years. 25 is not even that unusual. And in fact, from some of the guys that banded birds out west and had older banded populations or had been banding longer than we have birds in their population that are over 35 years old. The other thing we found out was that a minority of the breeding pairs produce a majority of the young. And that's, again, probably a reflection of territory quality. Better territory, more chicks. One of the other things we were interested in, like I said, we had several hundred recaptures, and some of these are several years apart. So we looked at variation in plumage and eye color. Eye color varies between cranes quite a bit, or among cranes quite a bit. And we had hoped initially that this was a way of telling how old they were, but it doesn't work out that way. But anyway, when we first started noticing this, we didn't have the book that told us what the real colors were supposed to be. And so we used the lifesaver colors, and these dark-eyed birds, we call them a cherry lifesaver. And that turns out to be actually a flame scarlet was the actual color that's supposed to go with that. The other one that's probably the commonest color is orange, just like orange lifesaver. That turns out to be chrome orange. And then the rarest eye color was a light, we called it pineapple. The book calls it straw yellow. Chick eyes, when they first hatch, are really, really dark. It almost looks black, but it's really a dark, like an umber color. And they lighten as they age, and then they get darker as they get lightened and then dark and get darker as they get older. One of the other things we found was that there's a lot of variation in plumage. There's a lot of these white feathers show up throughout especially on the wing. And the other thing that we found was about half of the birds have some kind of scattered white featherings at the back of the head, around the nape of the head. We also had a couple of times you'd see this pure white Sandhill crane, and every population seems to have one or two every year. This was a bird that was a migratory bird that showed up into land, and they often get mistaken for whooping cranes or hybrids between whooping cranes and sandhill cranes, but they're just a leucistic sandhill crane. We also had one with that had 2 white toenails for whatever reason that was. We don't know. One of the things we did find that you can age cranes by the way they molt their wing feathers. Cranes do not replace all their wing feathers every year. And so when you see a bird with mixed age wing feathers, outer wing feathers, primaries in particular, that's usually a bird that's at least 3 years old. So they don't, like I said, they don't start replacing those outer wing feathers until their 3rd year. So when you see a bird with mixed age feathers, you know it's a breeding age bird. This is not to be confused with the feathers of a juvenile bird, which has those buffy tip coverts like we talked about earlier. And you can even age a bird in the wild sometimes if you get a good look at the wing or get a picture of the wing. This is an adult bird. You can see there's at least 2, maybe 3 different age feathers in that wing. The outer feather, the number 10 primary, is brand new, and the 3 next to it are older, and then there's the one next to that is probably a medium age. So we would certainly call that an adult bird. One of the other things we were interested in finding out about what the diseases and mortalities were in a wild population of cranes. One of the big concerns when we first started talking about introducing whooping cranes was mortality due to disease, because in captivity, they're extremely vulnerable to Eastern equine encephalitis. And we know we have Eastern equine in Florida. So the big concern was if we release birds down here, would they succumb to encephalitis, right off the bat? So we wanted to know what diseases and what issues there were with Florida cranes. So one of the things we found out was that disease is not a real big issue. There's a few things, but not a major mortality factor. This is a bird that we handled that had an injured head, probably the result of another crane stabbing it in the head. We also saw one with a uncharacteristically crooked neck, which turned out to be an arthritic condition. We also had one with these big tumors on its leg, which probably resulted from avian pox becoming tumorous. This bird was definitely encumbered, could not walk like a normal crane. And we considered removing that big tumor on its leg, but when we took it to the vet school, they said this would be so traumatic the bird would probably die. So it's just as well to, hopefully he could recover on his own. But anyway, the bird was released untreated. One of the other things we found was that one of the big unnatural mortality factors was peanut toxicosis. They will eat peanuts, and we know from past experience in Texas that they're extremely vulnerable to a toxin that develops on peanuts, particularly peanuts that are left on top of the ground and experience a little bit of cold weather. And cold, wet, and on top of the ground seem to be the components that produce this toxin. And when they get it, if they get a big enough dose, they are unable to raise their neck. It causes a neck paresis, or paralysis of the neck. They can't lift their head up. So they can walk, they can fly, they can vocalize, but they can't feed or drink. So it's not a good thing for them in the long run unless they can recover. And they will recover to some extent on their own. But we found that if we capture them and elevate the head in the captive situation, they recover rather quickly. But in the wild, if they don't recover on their own, they're highly vulnerable to predators with this condition. Fences are another big issue for Florida cranes. They don't have any
Sandhill Cranes.
Excuse me.
I just wanted to tell you the remote on my on the TV in the Florida room crapped out, and I put new batteries in and they worked. Could you imagine both of
Go ahead, Steve.
Anyway, what I was saying was The regular barbed wire fences, the common barbed wire fence, is not a real issue for them. They can easily go under a barbed wire fence. It's this welded wire, hog wire, American wire, whatever you want to call it. This kind of fencing that's particularly common around horses. There's usually a strand of barbed wire across the top, and cranes will walk up to a fence, and instead of, you would think they just fly right over it. Instead of flying over it, they'd rather hop over it. And sometimes they come down on top of the fence and get their leg tangled, and it's not a good thing. So, with apologies to Robert Frost, fences don't always make good neighbors. The other thing we found was a major cause of mortality, unnatural mortality, as being hit by cars or power line strikes. This is particularly a characteristic of these birds that become urbanized sandhill cranes. One of the questions is, so what happens when one of these birds dies or is injured, and a member of a pair? When a pair member is injured or dies, what happens? This bird has lost its foot, and it's obviously not going to be capable of raising a chick, so they will lose their mate. And what we found was that when one of these birds dies or is injured, the surviving bird or the remaining bird will quickly repair. Sometimes we had one bird that lost its mate in the morning, and by the afternoon it had a new mate. So they're not sentimental. They just will find another mate rather quickly. And most repairings that we found in situations, the female is usually older than the male. Partly because there's so much pressure among, and when you've got a population that's, it's at its carrying capacity, is what they say, where they're saturated habitat. There's a lot of birds that want an opportunity to breed, and a lot of those are young males. So when a female becomes available, one of the young males is right there to jump in and take over the territory. We had one female that changed mates between two different males. It was like a trio, and she'd be paired up with one male, and then a few days later she'd be paired up with another male, and she changed mates 20 times in 1 year, over 20 times in 1 year. But the thing we found that happens, most of these birds that repair, they are familiar with each other. They've known each other. They either share a feeding site, a roosting site, or they were neighbors of a nesting pair, were neighbors. A lot of times they know each other. They're familiar. So that's why I'm thinking this pair bonding is a long time of familiar experience, doing the same thing together over time. So one of the problems, like I was mentioning, is this encroachment of habitat and urbanization of an acclimation to people, becoming habituated to urban situations and people. They're perfectly happy to just, as long as they're left alone, they'll let people walk right by them. And I'm sure in Central Florida, you've seen this many times. One of the problems with these urbanized birds or habituated birds is they can become aggressive. This little boy got pecked in the face by a crane at a park because he was eating a potato chip, and the crane thought he needed that potato chip. So he tried to take it away from the boy, and ended up pecking him in the face. So one of the things we found is that crane populations are changing as habitat changes, and habitat is the key to sustaining a crane population, Florida crane or greater sandhill cranes. One of the things we've noted in recent years is the proportion of Florida cranes, or proportion of Florida wintering greater sandhill cranes, is declining. Even though the population is expanding, the proportion that come to Florida is declining. And Florida crane numbers have also declined in recent years. We did a study where we looked at available habitat. We know how much habitat it takes to support a family of cranes. We know what the characteristics of the population are, how many adults there are, how many subadults there are, and how many young there are in the population. So by looking at available habitat, we're able to sort of extrapolate a population based on habitat. And in 2003, there were a little over 4,600 sandhill cranes in Florida. And this was 2,500 fewer than we estimated there were in 1974, the first year we had access to this habitat data. And this was based on satellite imagery. So the population is declining as habitat is declining. So habitat management is critical to sustaining the population, and perhaps even increasing the population. It has to be not just preserved, but it also has to be managed. And fire is one of the best ways to manage habitat for cranes. They, like I said, they like open areas, and they need them to feed in, particularly when they've got young. So fire works pretty well. Mowing can be done. Mowing will help, but it's awfully expensive, and you can't get a whole lot of area covered very quickly with mowing. The other thing that they can adapt to is grazing. We know that sandhill cranes are 6 million years old. So for most of that time, they probably depended on, these Pleistocene herbivores to keep the habitat under control. So if we look at grazing, we should consider cattle as being a Pleistocene relic, perhaps, as a tool for managing cranes. Florida sandhill cranes, or sandhill cranes in general, but Florida cranes in particular for non-migratory, are the most numerous crane in the world. So they have become de facto guinea pigs for all crane studies, management, whatever. Capture techniques, all that stuff is worked out first with sandhills, and then it's applied to other species. So we did this work with non-migratory sandhills before we started working with non-migratory whooping cranes. And by the same token, we could produce a non-migrating population of whooping cranes. All of the cranes that remained, whooping cranes that remained, were migratory. So we were concerned that it might be a genetic thing, but what turns out is that it's a learned thing. So we could teach them not to migrate with a little more money and a little more effort. You could also teach them to migrate. And so part of the project was to, once we got figured out we could do it, they applied the same ideas with this ultralight population that was taught to migrate behind an ultralight aircraft. And what we found, the characteristic was, if they don't make the first flight south with their parents in the fall, they won't go back. By the same token, if you can teach them to fly down with the ultralight aircraft, fly down to Florida in the fall, they will repeat this route in the spring on their own. They don't have to have an aircraft to show them the way. They have learned the route and they will repeat it on their own. So we ended up with having a pretty good population of non-migrating whooping cranes. We had 48 non-migratory whooping cranes, nesting attempts, 96 nesting attempts, fledged 16 chicks. Currently, there are less than a dozen probably left in Florida. The major problem we had, as you probably have heard, was predation. Predation was exaggerated to some extent by the drought that occurred while we were doing this. Florida was having a big drought, which increased their susceptibility to predators. But the good news is that now there are over 600 wild whooping cranes in the Aransas wood buffalo population, which is the original population, the residual population of whooping cranes, which at one point was down to, you'll hear the word 16 or 15 individuals. Anyway, they've all come back from that. There's also 80 birds now in the eastern migratory population, and about 75 or over 75 in the Louisiana non-migrating population. They took the data that we had, or the experience we had with non-migrating cranes, whooping cranes in Florida, and applied it in Louisiana, and the birds are doing quite well out there. So there is reason to hope that we can sustain both sandhill cranes and whooping cranes. We know what it takes. It's just a matter of committing to keeping the habitat available for them. So thank you.
Oh, that was terrific. Thank you so much, Steve.
Yes, thank you. So some of the questions, whoa, let me go back. We had a lot of stuff here. Cindy was mentioning it was very interesting how the male moves his neck so that you can determine the sex versus the female.
Yeah.
And she also said that in Nebraska, her cousin has like 1,000 sandhill cranes, but these, and she was asking, so these are not Florida Sandhill cranes, is that correct?
No. The Nebraska cranes primarily are the lesser sandhill cranes, the ones that breed in the Arctic, and some of the sandhills, some of those those central flyway sandhills actually breed in Siberia. So they're coming across the Bering Sea from Russia, and that's the highest population of any subspecies of crane, the lesser sandhill crane. They get, oh gosh, sometimes 200,000 birds in the Platte in Nebraska. The total worldwide population of sandhill cranes is about 500,000. So they're, like I said, by far the most numerous crane in the world. But the ones in Nebraska primarily are lesser sandhills, and they spend the winter in Texas and New Mexico, and some of them actually go into Mexico itself.
Very cool. Annie said, since the cranes can change the hue of the redness on the top of the head, does that change the shape of the red heart as you view it?
Yeah, they can expand it. They can make it bigger. They can pull it down. They pull the back of the comb down on the back of the neck and make it quite a bit bigger. So yes, they can change the shape of it as well as the color.
And Cindy wanted to know, why don't they just throw a net over them instead of tranquilizing them?
Yeah. We found out that salt doesn't work. We tried that. Salt on the tail doesn't work. You got to have them a little bit submissive. The other techniques that people have used, when she's talking about a net, she probably means a rocket net, would be a net that's carried by explosion. Rockets will go off, carry the net out over a bunch of birds. Because cranes are so tall, it works fairly well. The rocket nets work well with turkeys and waterfowl, where they're much shorter. Cranes spend a lot of time with their heads up and their neck up, and they're they got long legs. Rocket nets are not as good. We tried some rocket nets and it just doesn't work as well. And the good thing about tranquilizers is you had to be very careful when you do it. You can't just go out and randomly disperse it. We did not use drug capture when there were a lot of birds feeding. You can't control that many birds. So we would try to get a smaller group of birds, 20 or 30 birds at a time, and no more than that. We found also that you don't want to try to catch birds with tranquilizers during cold weather. They're very susceptible to overdosing when it's cold. So we learned to kind of manipulate the dosage based on weather conditions and the number of birds that were feeding and how aggressively they were feeding. We ended up with a mortality rate of almost nothing. And we know that the birds, like I said, recovered pretty quickly, and we could release them the next day.
Very good. Jim Hofstadt from Tallahassee was asking, why did the sandhill crane adapt more easily to change compared to the whooping crane, who
That's a
has
really
had
good
a
question.
much more difficult time?
That's a really good question. The people that think about things like that have said that probably there never were a large number of whooping cranes. Like I said, there's 500,000 sandhill cranes now, somewhere, maybe probably more than that by now. But there never were more than a few thousand whooping cranes. They require a much bigger territory. They also are much more carnivorous than sandhill cranes. They're not as prone to eating grain and stuff like that as sandhills are. I think the goal, I don't know what the recovery team goal is now or the recovery plan goal is now, but we looked at 1,000 as being a good number. Well, there's almost 1,000 now. I mean, when I was on the recovery team, we were really excited when the population hit 100. So, now it's 600. We're talking about the Aransas wood buffalo, the ones that migrate from Canada to Texas. That population is doing a whole lot better than anybody ever thought it would. So yeah, but there's not going to be as many whooping cranes as sandhill cranes because they're much more, I think they require a lot more habitat and they're a lot less omnivorous than sandhills.
Oh, and he just also wanted to say that he wanted to shout out and say that we worked together at GFC, FWC, although we never met.
Oh, really? Well, that's good.
Yeah. Annie just said she had seen 3 chicks with a pair of sandhills a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And Cindy wanted to know, when did sandhill cranes first show up in Florida?
They've been here for a long time. We've got some bones from Payne's Prairie that probably suggest they were here 10,000 years ago. One of the interesting things that recently they found out genetically, the 3 non-migratory populations of sandhills that I talked about, the Florida sandhill, the Mississippi sandhill, and the Cuban sandhill, are all genetically much more closely related to eastern greater sandhill cranes than they are to each other, which suggests to me that they each developed independently of one another. They're not that closely related. The Mississippi's, Floridas, and Cubans are not that closely related, any more closely related to each other than they are to the migratory birds. Migration is maybe a learned behavior, and so they could easily learn not to migrate. And it may be one of the things that when a population reaches a certain level, it'll spin off a non-migratory segment. There were non-migratory whooping cranes in Louisiana until the 1950s. And it may just be that that's the way they do things. A lot of the other cranes in the world do have a non-migrating segment of the population too.
And Jim wanted to know, once a sandhill crane reaches a healthy maturity, are they pretty much bulletproof from predators?
Yes. Yeah. A healthy bird is probably not very susceptible to predation. Like I said, when we had those peanut poisoning situations, eagles and coyotes figured out real quick, and they'll take advantage of that. But a healthy bird is pretty much a hard target for a predator. I've seen sandhills with chicks being, I won't say the eagle was trying to take the chick, but the eagle got a little close and was maybe making a nuisance of himself. They actually jump up in the air and throw their feet up at him, like that kick rake posture that I showed before. They will actually do that to an avian predator, like an eagle, especially probably a golden eagle. Golden eagles will take some cranes. They will, but a bald eagle, no.
And then I think you answered this when Cindy asked if they roost when they fly up in trees, but I think you said they roost in the water. So
there's only one crane in the world that can get in a tree, and that's African crown crane. The rest of them are all ground bound throughout their life. They can't, their feet are not right for roosting and sitting in a tree. They have 3 toes in the front. Their hind toe, which would be the one that would allow them to perch, is elevated and much reduced. So it's basically a vestigial toe. So they don't have the capacity to grab onto things because they don't have like they can't do like that. They could balance, perhaps, but the limit has to be pretty substantial for them to do it. And I think that's what crown cranes do, is they balance on a limb. They're much smaller than sandhills. So cranes do not go into trees.
Delcy said she enjoys when she sees a dancing pair or group.
Yeah, it's pretty neat. there's a whole, I don't know if anybody's done this, but it could be a whole study of how the components of a dance, because if you watch them do the whole thing, they will pick up a stick or a stone. Sometimes it's a piece of a cow pie. They'll flip it up in the air and then they start dancing, and they'll actually throw them feet up and all that. And I think a lot of that is to call attention to themselves. When they see, like I said, when they see a predator, they will dance to call attention to the fact that they've spotted a predator. They will dance if they like I said, if the weather changes, they will dance, and it's a contagious behavior.
Sherry says she's observed sandhills probing the ground with open bills. Wouldn't their bill fill up with dirt before it reached grub or larvae?
They usually, they've got, if you when you actually get your hands on one of them, their bill is not stiff. It's got a little flexibility to it. So when they have that open bill and they stick it in the ground, they're actually trying to sense something. And I often wondered if the tip of the bill doesn't have a whole lot of nerve endings in it that they can use to detect stuff. Like they eat a lot of tubers. They eat a lot of, they'll eat grubs. They'll eat stuff underground. They'll eat worms. They'll find stuff underground, but they're actually probing for seeds, tubers, and roots and things like that when they have their bill open like that. But it is flexible. It's not stiff.
And she also asked, how much interspecies aggression will a pair of sandhills tolerate? I think she talked about seeing one adult approach 30 white pelicans with a direct walk in a small pasture pond and scatter them to another area.
Well, maybe that was their pond. I mean, they may do that. I have never seen them aggressive towards pelicans, but wouldn't surprise me. I mean, when they're on a territory, they really don't like anything else around them that's going to be, any kind of a threat at all, size-wise, competition for food. Like I said, the main thing they're worried about when they've got chicks, small chicks, even almost grown chicks, is enough resources to sustain that chick. And a chick, a young one, is ground bound for the first 75 days. They're ground bound. They can't go anywhere, so they have to depend on that territory. So that's very important to them to keep that, anything else that might be competing for resources away from that territory.
Jim asks, why do greater sandhill cranes migrate and Florida sandhill cranes don't?
Like I said, it may just be that the habitat can support both non-migratory and migratory. And I think, like I said before, the population reaches a certain level and a segment of the population will just spin off as become a non-migrating population.
And
it's a matter of tradition. Those that do keep doing it, and those that don't keep not doing it.
Deborah, maybe you can answer this one. If you see one with a broken leg, who can come and rehab the birds? Do you know somebody that rehabs sandhill cranes?
I don't, but there in Kissimmee, Osceola County, there is a Sandhill Crane Society. And we can try to find that number for people.
Oh, okay. If you do not know the date the eggs are laid, are there any signs that hatching is close if you're watching a nest?
Not that I've ever detected. You can, well, let's see. Not from just observing them. The chicks will start making noises about 24 hours before they hatch. They'll start peeping and carrying on. The eggs will actually turn. They move inside the egg. In fact, one of the ways when we were doing a lot of egg transplants, where we take eggs from migratory sandhills and put them in non-migratory sandhill nests to see if the chicks would migrate, genetically predisposition to migrate or would learn to not migrate. I mean, that's a whole different topic. But anyway, one of the ways you tell if an egg is viable, you put it in water. If it sinks, it's not viable. If it's got a viable chick in it, it will float, the big end up, the air cell will be up. And if you watch it, it'll turn, it'll twitch and carry on. That means that's a live egg. So the eggs do move. So the females know that they've got live eggs under them. But we also found that they will sit they'll sit on a rock. I mean, not literally, but they will sit on we use dummy eggs to keep them going long enough that we could implant or transplant some eggs into the nest. They'll sit on an egg, an unhatched egg, for about 10 days beyond its normal hatch date. So normally it takes 30 days. So they'll sit on for 40, 45 days before they give up and walk away.
If you are with adult cranes daily and talk to them, can they recognize humans? This from
Yes.
Christine.
Yeah, they recognize us as individuals. They certainly do. I've talked to a number of people that have cranes that are familiar with them, that will walk up to them. Somebody that's not familiar to them, they will not do that. And the birds we worked with, when we were putting out a lot of bait, pre-baiting the capture sites, or just baiting the cranes, they know the truck. They know our truck. So when the truck would come, it was time for the corn, they were there. So they recognize individuals for sure, and they recognize situations.
And great presentation. Christine wanted to know, at what age do they develop the red head? And she said 1 year.
It starts when they're about half grown. You'll start to see a distinct difference in color on the top of the head, and they'll have a different kind of fuzz up there. You can see where the patch is going to be. And then as they get towards full grown, full size, that bird that I showed that was the one is just before they left their parents, they're getting a comb. It's not bright, but it's there. It's not quite as red as it's going to be when they're fully adult, but it's there. So maybe 3/4 of the way grown.
A lot of thanks for the program. Great program. And Martha Withers writes, in Michigan, there's a push every few years to have a hunting season, and I've been told they are very good eating. Apparently, farmers don't like the huge flocks in their fields.
Well, I've never eaten one, so I can't tell you if they're good to eat or not. But I know there's hunting seasons in the West. They've got hunting seasons in Tennessee. They've got hunting seasons in I think Alabama. Maybe they wanted to have one in Kentucky. Cranes are pretty darn smart, and usually once they've been shot at, they're pretty shy. They're not easy bird to harvest. Let's put it that way. And you know, I a lot of mixed emotions about hunting cranes. I don't think they're a particularly wary target. Let's put it that way. I mean, they're not hard to kill or not hard to hit. They don't fly that fast. They're not like a duck. They certainly don't have the ability to reproduce like ducks do. Ducks have a much bigger clutch size than cranes, and that's one of the disadvantages to hunting basically almost everything we hunt in the United States anyway, or Canada, are selected species, which are the opposite of what I was talking about with cranes. Our selected species are like white rats, high fecundity, big birth, big litter sizes, mature quickly, reproduce quickly. Cranes are totally different kind of. They're a K-selected species. K-selected species do not lend themselves to sustainable harvest. So.
And Greg wants to know, how do cranes locate their prey? By sound, smell, or sight?
No, it's mostly sight. They're a big sight. Yeah, they don't have a great sense of smell, and they just know if it's vegetation that they're eating or plant material that they're eating. They know where to go to find it. The rest of it is, like I said, their bill is very sensitive. So they can tell by touch if they've got a potential prey item. But they're visual predators. One of the things you'll notice if you're in a marsh situation and there's lots of cranes around, you'll always see if a crane's walking through the marsh, there'll almost always be red-winged blackbirds flying around their head. Well, they're looking for blackbird nests. They'll eat the eggs, they'll eat the baby blackbirds. So the adult blackbirds are going to be trying to drive these birds away. So they're finding these nests visually, and they will, like I said, eat the eggs and eat the babies. So they're mostly visual.
And Deborah Green wants to know, tell us about Necedah National Wildlife Refuge and how that fits in.
Necedah,
Rita.
well, that's one of the places where they've released the migratory population of whooping cranes. And those are the ones they taught to migrate to Florida. And a lot of the sandhills from there come to Florida, and that's what the hoopers did, was they blended in with the sandhills. They followed the sandhills, and initially they came to Florida, but now that the sandhills are going more towards Tennessee and Alabama, that's where the whooping cranes are going. So they're learning from the sandhills.
Are they still releasing them to Necedah?
No, we haven't released any since '91. They're still releasing a few. They're releasing them in Louisiana, and they're releasing, I don't know if they're releasing any more in the migratory population, the eastern migratory population, or not. I think I heard that had reached its, sustainability. I think they're still releasing a few birds in Louisiana, though. One of the big concerns initially was because of the disease issue, there was a real concern about possible disease contamination of the wild population, the Aransas wood buffalo population. So one of the reasons they chose to come to Florida first, as opposed to Louisiana, because we were far enough away from Texas that there was no chance, or very limited chance, of any of the birds we released here mixing with the Texas population. So if they did migrate, they would go north and south most likely, and not go west. So as disease became less and less of a concern, now they've had some birds from Louisiana that have wandered into Texas. So it's not been a big, red flag warning that we got some captive reared birds going to mingle with the wild population. So that's become not as big a concern as it had been in the past.
Cindy said she's learned more in this hour than she did in the wild. Thank you so much. And Cherry has photos of that aggression with the pelicans.
Oh, really? That would be cool.
Jim said, excellent presentation, learned so much. Cindy said, you know so much. Thank you for sharing. And that birds are very smart. Love them.
Yeah, they are extremely smart.
And Christine mentioned our gators in waters where nests are never seem to go after adults or colts, yet they go after other ducks and their babies. Is it because of the size?
Part of the reason the gators have not been a real issue in terms of predation was in the marshes that cranes like to frequent, there's lots of vegetation. And a gator is going to, especially a gator of any size, is going to have a hard time sneaking up on a crane with you got a bunch of pickleweed around. It's going to make a big disturbance, and the cranes will leave. There has been some predation, particularly with whooping cranes, when we had the drought and the only open water was deep water that had gators in it. We did have some gator predation. One of the real problems, though, is gators will haul out on a crane nest when there's eggs on there and destroy the nest. That has happened a few times. It's not a great concern, but it does happen. But gator predation on adult sandhill crane is probably fairly rare because they don't go to marshes that don't have vegetation, or don't go to water that doesn't have vegetation in it.
And Annie just said, I love learning about the beautiful birds. Thank you so much. And Jim enjoyed the talk. And Cindy said, very interesting that they eat red-winged blackbird eggs. Gail said, thank you so much. And Christine also said, thank you so much and for answering all our questions. And that is it.
All right.
Thank you so much for taking your time to go through all those questions and
Sure, sure.
great